Wales, Africa and the World, the podcast from Cymru Africa, championing global solidarity and the connections between Wales, Africa and beyond. My name is Peter Gilby, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by former First Minister of Wales, Carwyn Jones. In his career, he's played a pivotal role in the inception of the Wales and Africa programme, and his insights will shed light on the vision that shaped it, its achievements and the threats it faces in an increasingly divided world. He recently stepped down as chair of Size of Wales after 4 years of service, and in March of this year he was made a member of the House of Lords as the Right Honourable Lord Jones of Pen-y-bont. In today's episode, we'll delve into the origins and the ongoing significance of the Welsh Government's Wales and Africa programme, which this year is celebrating its 20th anniversary. Later on, we'll also discuss the political landscape and the rise of the far-right movements and the decisions and the impact of cutting overseas aid by various governments across the world. And then in the final segment, we'll be doing a bit of current affairs commentary and finding out about what's been going on in Africa this week. I'm really pleased to say hello to Carwyn Jones. Hi Carwyn, diolch am ymuno.
Well, hello Peter, diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad I ddod.
So let's go back to the year 2005. Hurricane Katrina, Make Poverty History campaign, the landmark Kyoto Protocol on climate change. Tony Blair secured his third successive Westminster election win. The 7/7 bombings in London. Wales won its first Grand Slam since the 70s. It was a busy year. With that context, what inspired the creation of the Wales and Africa programme?
Well, it was Rodri who was First Minister, and he wanted to move it forward. I think the inspiration was that we wanted to do our bit in terms of helping people in other countries, but in a way that was targeted. Because if we just provided money and then couldn't say where that money had gone, people can get a bit cynical. So the idea was the money was earmarked for particular projects, tree planting particularly at that time, and then of course the government could demonstrate we're putting in X amount of money and this is what we're getting in return. These are the trees that are being planted in return. So it was really important at the time, I remember, for us to be able to identify targets that would be reached so we could measure how the money was being spent. It wasn't a lot of money. $750,000 wasn't a huge amount of money. And it was really important that money was spent in the most effective way possible. And that it was decided, right, we will support one particular project at that stage, and then we can show people what that project is delivering.
With that context, what was your own personal inspiration for supporting the Wales and Africa programme?
Well, at the time, I was Minister for the Environment, Planning in the Countryside. So we knew, climate change was in its beginnings, really, in terms of it being a debate. We knew that what we were doing in Wales and in so many Western countries was having a negative effect on the climate, and we wanted to do our bit. Being Minister for the Environment didn't mean just looking at Wales. I felt it was important that we looked at the global environment. How do we improve the global environment so that what we do doesn't negatively affect other people? And Wales for Africa as a programme was a great idea, and that was taken forward. And we worked with a small part of Uganda, Mbale, and because we did that, we could target that area with the funds, and we could see the delivery that happened there. And you could see not just tree planting, but the people who, for example, women who were making an income out of the bees that went to live in the forest. A traditional occupation in Uganda for women, and a lot of them were widows. They didn't have a source of income. So it wasn't just planting trees, and the idea was we plant trees because the coffee crops are failing because of climate change. The trees provide the shade, but there were other benefits as well of doing that. But it was absolutely crucial to be able to say, this is what we spent, and this is what's been achieved.
We've talked a bit about how, there was a small budget allocated for this, and, there was the importance of doing this work in the context of climate change and doing our bit. There would be many people nowadays who would criticise the Wales and Africa programme, saying Wales has no business in foreign affairs. I'm sure you disagree, and would have at the time too. What was it about the programme that was sort of backed up by the programme for government at the time? What was it about this particular project that was sort of in Wales's interests, despite it, being in Uganda?
Well, first of all, we do have a role in foreign affairs. Not formally, we're not a sovereign state, we don't have embassies, but we do have a role in making contacts around the world to create trade and investment. If you don't go looking for it, someone else will climb all over you and get it instead. So we did have a role in that sense, even though it wasn't a formal sovereign state role. Back in 2005, the financial situation was a lot easier than it is now and has been since 2010. And we wanted to show that Wales was an outward-looking country. Now, there were some of the critics of devolution before it was established Wales will turn in on itself. It won't look outside. Well, an outward-looking country looks to do what it can to help others, so that we can show that we recognise that the way we live has a negative effect on others. So what can we do in a small way, it's true, with the money, to help people to overcome the effects of the way that we are actually living? So at the time, certainly there was a strong view that it was important that we had an international programme, that it was reasonable, it was targeted, and we could demonstrate those results. And that's what it all came down to. Because the critics have always said, well, where does the money go? We can show where it goes. It's easy enough to see what the results actually are. 20 years on, we live in a world where people are more financially insecure. They start to question where money goes. You'll see people saying, well, the money should all be spent at home. There was a question recently, I think, in the Senate where the question was asked, well, what shouldn't this money be spent on farming in Wales? This is a tiny amount of money compared to the amount of money that goes to farming. And I've got no problem with going to farming. I looked after farmers for 6 years, but you can't compare the two. This is a tiny amount of money. The Welsh government's budget is 20 billion plus. 750,000 is a small amount of money, but what it delivers goes far beyond the actual financial amount.
I mean, you've just sort of touched on it for my next question. There will be many voices here in Wales and interfering voices from London and possibly America saying that there are bigger domestic priorities that Wales should be focusing on. You've touched on the cost of living crisis. There's NHS waiting times as well, educational attainment. All of these are quite prominent in people's minds as issues to be dealt with. Why is it that this programme should be maintained?
Well, of course, health and education are important. But let's compare the budgets here. The health budget is not far off £9-10 billion. Education budget, that's measured in the billions. We're talking here about a budget that's measured in the hundreds of thousands. Even if you took away all that money and put it into health and education, the effect would be minimal compared, because the budgets are so big. But I've seen the effect that this money has on so many communities. It is a small amount of money in government terms, considering the budget is thousands of millions. And I think it shows Wales in a good light. I think it's an example of Wales, in a small way, affecting the world positively and being able to say, look, we recognise that we all exist on this planet together and we want to do what we can to help. And it doesn't take resources away from health and education. It's a tiny, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what health and education get, and rightly so, because health and education are priorities for the people of Wales.
And so, given the changing global context, and if we accept that the programme will continue, if that argument is won, should it or could it evolve in any way? How would you like to see it possibly be going forward? Well,
one of the things, I chair a charity called Size of Wales, and we have to run the Wales for Africa programme, particularly the tree planting. But also that work over the years has branched out into trying to stop deforestation in the first place. We've planted millions of trees, but we also need to make sure that we don't lose trees as well. So working with indigenous communities, particularly in Peru, for example, we've looked to help those communities from preventing illegal logging, illegal deforestation, because it's like filling the bath with the plague out otherwise. So I think it will evolve over the next few years. It's still got its core business, if you like, which is tree planting, but perhaps it'll go beyond that and start thinking about, okay, how do we stop deforestation from happening in the first place, rather than planting trees, which is important, while trees are still being lost elsewhere, not just perhaps in Uganda, which is where most of the work takes place, but in Kenya, where we also work, and of course in South America.
So let's move on a little bit to sort of the broader international development situation. It's been obvious for years. There's been a rise in far-right policies and politicians, and there's real threats and actions being taken against the international development sector and global solidarity. President Trump has utterly dismantled and removed USAID, which has had profound impacts across the world. And in February of this year, Prime Minister Keir Starmer cut the overseas aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3% of GDP, following a cut from Boris Johnson in 2019. What are your feelings on these forces and these budget changes and these decisions that are happening?
Well, there are 2 points, really. First of all, there's clearly a movement. I'm not going to use conspiracy. That makes me sound as if I'm going off on down a rabbit hole somewhere. But there's clearly a movement to say to people, the reason why you're feeling badly off is because of these people over there, these people who are migrants. In fact, the reason why people have felt worse off is because of the financial crash in 2008, because of bankers who took stupid decisions and invested in projects that were bound to fail. Those people have not been held to account. Instead, those very same financial interests are saying, oh, no, it has nothing to do with us. It's all to do with these people over here who are depriving you of money. So there's a classic example of the dead cat strategy there, And in America, what we've seen recently is basically money being taken from the poorest and given to the richest. It's a reverse Robin Hood syndrome. So money being taken not just from overseas aid, but Medicare, for example, and shoveled into the pockets of the richest so they can get even richer than they are now. So that narrative is driving the debate over international development. But let's not pretend it has anything to do with money being channeled back to poor people in the UK. It's to do with money being channeled into the pockets of the richest, as we've already seen in the US. And the second point I think that's worth emphasising, soft power. If we leave aside the overseas aid and the way it helps people, which people understand, it's this example of soft power. If you abandon countries and you abandon aid to them, other countries will move in, China particularly. So do we want a situation where if we pull back and the US pulls back from its aid programs, that China just moves in and those countries then become friendlier to China? I mean, if you're looking at geopolitical strategy, it's daft. Why would you want to retreat from the world while another country will simply become more powerful? So you get weaker, China gets more powerful. That's what's happening. In the States, they don't seem to understand that. Some of the politicians there, they can't see beyond their own seas. But that's the reality of the world. So even leaving aside the humanitarian aspect, which we all know is important, you've also got this geopolitical aspect that's hugely important in terms of the way the world will work in the future. Who has the most allies? And at the moment, we are giving up countries to Chinese influence. And China, they'll see an opportunity. You can understand why they do it. They'll say, okay, well, they won't help you, but we will. Here we are. We'll come in and we'll help you out. Those countries become friendlier to China. Is that wise? I don't think it is.
And what do you think about the policy decisions in this country? Are you hopeful that we'll return to 0.7% of GDP being allocated to aid? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I regret the cut that's been made. Will it go back to 0.7% anytime soon? No, if I'm realistic. I think people suddenly haven't become uncharitable overnight, frankly. Like if you had another Live Aid style, it's 40 years since Live Aid. I remember watching it. It's 40 years since Live Aid. I don't think people are more uncharitable now than they were then. There's just this vocal minority who are trying to give the impression they're bigger than they actually are. And we've got to be careful that vocal minority doesn't drive government policy in the UK. No matter how loud they are, ultimately, I don't believe that they are a majority. I think if you had a Live Aid concert today, it would be as successful as it was now.
We've seen justification for the cut in UK overseas aid as, prioritising national defence. Do you think there is a role for aid as a tool for defence or as a tool for security? Does it seem like a rational choice, or is it actually counterproductive to what they want?
Without any shadow of a doubt, it is positive in terms of security. The reason why so many people are trying to come to the UK is they're coming from countries that are unstable, where they feel their lives are in danger, and where civic society is broken down. You can't blame people for wanting to go somewhere where they think that things will be far better from them. People have always done that throughout history. If you withdraw aid, and we've withdrawn militarily from many of these countries, then more and more people will feel that they have to leave, and they will look to come into Europe, and many of them will look to come to the UK. So actually, if I wanted to be hard-nosed about it, I would argue that overseas aid is a way to deal with migration. If you're able to help people, people don't want to leave the countries that they're from. Maybe that's a big step for so many people. But if you're able to provide people with opportunities, security in the countries where they live, they are far less likely to become migrants. And this idea that the far right have, we'll just build some kind. I don't know what their idea is. I have no idea what their plan is. I haven't got one. So rather than seeing the small boats and the dangers people face in coming in those small boats, we should start thinking about what's the root cause of this. And the root cause is there are so many countries where people are insecure. They can't live. They fear for their lives. What can we do to reduce that insecurity so that people stay in the country where they're from? They want to, but they can't because of the circumstances that exist there. You can't just say, well, let's stop the small boats in some unspecified way, which is what Nigel Farage is doing. You've got to think about, well, how can we make life more secure for people so they don't feel that they have to risk their lives on a barely inflated dinghy on the channel?
You've mentioned the N-word there, Nigel Farage. That takes us on to the fact that there's a Senate election next year. Opinion polls suggest that Reform UK Party might do quite well, benefiting from a proportional voting system, fortunately not cleaning the board like they might have done in a Westminster-style voting system. Do you think there's a risk of, the work of the Wales and Africa programme of global solidarity ending after next year?
No, because I don't see Reform being anywhere close to government. You have to have 49 seats to be able to govern. At most, they'll get 30, 31 perhaps, if they're lucky. They're mainly taking Conservative votes now. If the Conservatives had another 10 seats, it takes them to the early 40s. The electorate in Wales is largely centre to centre-left, but 60% and then 40% are centre to centre-right. And that will be the case in the Senate election. So I fully expect there to be a coalition of parties from the centre to centre-left. So yes, they'll be there, and yes, they'll have a voice, and yes, they will be vocal, but no, they won't be governing.
Let's put that depressing topic to one side and let's look forward and try and sort of be more positive and imagining a positive future. What advice would you give to the next Welsh government and the next administration about, the Wales and Africa programme, Hub Cymru Africa, the wider solidarity sector? What advice would you give to the next and future leaders of Wales about those programmes?
It's a small amount of money. It delivers well beyond the actual money that's put in. I've seen on the ground the difference it makes to people's lives. Don't be tempted to say, let's cut all overseas spending. It'll give you a tiny amount of money to spend on everything else. That Wales's name in the world is not as seen as positively as it once was. And it makes a huge difference to people's lives. If we're serious about climate change, we're serious about putting into effect programs that are going to help people who are affected by climate change. That's true in Africa as it is in Wales. So I hesitate to give advice to future Welsh governments. There's nothing worse than somebody who's been there saying, well, this is what I would do and blah, blah, blah. But I would say carry on. I really don't think that there is a swell of opinion in Wales that says, let's get rid of all this. I really don't. There's just a vocal minority of people who yap along and say this is all terrible. I don't think they're the majority.
Let's imagine Wales in 20 years' time. What do you hope that the legacy of the Wales and Africa programme to be in that time?
Well, personally, I would be alive. Secondly, in terms of the Wales for Africa programme, I would like to be able to see the difference that it makes to people's lives continuing. So when I went to Uganda, the soil in Uganda is fantastic. 10 feet of volcanic soil, anything grows in the soil. And people, the worst position you can be in is if you live in a city and you're living in a slum because you've got no land. If you have land, you can feed your family and you grow coffee for cash. It's the coffee crops that were being affected. So I'd like to see more and more of those people who are growing coffee keeping that money for themselves, to be able to make a living for themselves and their families, and to be able to do that because of the trees that have been planted to provide the shade for the coffee crops. I'd like to see more and more people making money, for example, out of honey, which provides a crucial source of income for so many people, to see that expand as well. So I think it's really an extension and expansion of what we're seeing already. People being able to have a livelihood that they otherwise wouldn't have if it wasn't for the Wales for Africa programme.
Carwyn Jones, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for coming in. Welcome back to Wales, Africa and the World. I'm pleased to welcome back Ore Ojelade, Diaspora and Inclusion Officer at Hub Cymru Africa, for our regular segment of Africa This Week. Hi, Ore.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Pete.
So this week, we're going to go to Kenya first, where we've seen quite huge protests being led by millennials and Gen Z. They've been going on over the past month, and they've been protesting the current administration led by President William Ruto. Been quite profound demonstrations. They've been met with quite horrific violence and oppression. Ore, what are your thoughts on this? What's the context or the history behind these protests?
Okay, so this is happening on a very significant day in Kenya called the Sabsab. So that means the 7th day of the 7th month, where the people of Kenya historically have fought for their freedom of speech, free elections, and sustainable government. So seeing that police brutality in that same day, in the modern age, is really happening again, it's a bit of a low punch to the government. So people, the Gen Zs and the millennials, who are often seen as the lazy ones, are striking into momentum, going on the street and protesting. And the government is gaslighting them to believing what's happening is actually not happening. So someone has lost their life, and over 38 people also have lost their lives during this protest, and the government still says nothing has happened. So the Gen Zs and millennials are focusing on free election and also police brutality, in the sense that the police who are meant to be helping them get protection, reporting them and reporting events that are happening, are the ones killing them. And you go to the government and ask for some of protection. That's not happening. And gaslighting you to believe that that's not the reality and that's not what's happening. But looking at the momentum of the youth people getting engaged in what's happening in their policies and their government is quite interesting to see. And you can see the parallels over the course of the wars. The same thing is happening in different countries, and what happened in previous countries is happening in Kenya at the moment.
It seems like there is a strained relationship between Kenyans and the police. What's the history there? Why is that relationship so strained?
I think from research, we say the relationship is strained because people are abusing their power. A civilian is basically wearing their t-shirt and their jeans, strolling on the road, but someone who is kitted in the police, who thinks he's stronger than them and has more power over them, tries to convey the power and exhibit his power. So I think that's the strain. And looking at it across the nations and looking at how the police brutality have come over people that are civilians, is quite interesting, in the sense that exerting power over the law force is questioning and taking advantage of the civilians because they know they have nobody to report, because you can't report the police to the police as well.
It's really concerning, the lack of respect for human life or dignity.
And no empathy as well.
Yeah, because, only last week, President Ruto was ordering his police to shoot at protesters, which is just an incredible escalation, isn't it?
Yeah, because if you think about it, you're ordering police to shoot at your people and you expect them to come back to report to you and respect your government. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, it's not going to happen.
So they go on the streets, go protest against your name and your government. And the basic solution you could think about is shooting at the people.
Mm-hmm. But that sort of action, I feel, it almost betrays the government, the president, because someone who is confident or secure in their beliefs don't really need to shoot at their opposition. They should be confident enough in their own convictions to not have to kill people to validate their beliefs. I was reading this morning that there was a report last week of a 12-year-old girl who unfortunately died as a result of the response to these protests when a stray bullet, went through the roof of a family home and hit her in the head, and she later died in hospital. And that is a tragedy in and of itself. But what's really bad about this example is the police's response to it, where they just denied it happened. And I think, that's just a real emblematic example of just the police's relationship with the citizens in Kenya, about how they value life and reality.
I think when you look at it, you can see that the power is striking, because you can have clear facts that the police did actually what they did. Even if it's alleged, there can be facts aligning to the fact that the police did that. And because you have to go back to report to the same police officers, there are ways they could hinder or tamper the evidence. So what are you reporting? The government isn't trustworthy enough. The police members are not trustworthy enough. So when next are you going to report to? So you can see that the Kenya people have lost all trust on all forms of government and are seeking out and relying on their own forces. So I think it's a credible thing that the Gen Zs and millennials are seeking forces using social media platforms. I'm not a big fan of X, but seeing the voice being amplified on X, Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, and amplifying their voice, because if they don't use social media platforms like this, the stories would not be told because they can block the reproduction of the news, because they have access to the news outlets, so they can reduce the numbers of things amplified to the media outlets and not really tell the authentic stories of the authentic people living there.
Let's move on to a different country. What's been happening in Nigeria this week?
So this week, rest in peace to the former president of Nigeria, General Muhammadu Buhari. He was one of the military rulers of Nigeria as well as the civilian president of Nigeria.
He was a military ruler in the 70s?
Yeah, in the early 70s.
Yeah. And then he was also elected when?
2015.
Okay. So he's been quite a prominent Nigerian figure for a long time.
Yeah, it's been there.
And he died this week.
Yeah.
So what's the significance of that?
I think the significance of it is that most people, all the supporters, are really he fought for insecurity. He strengthened the relationship between the members of state. And his critics are he didn't do that much. And he died in London. That's a big slap on his face.
Why is that?
If he had made, my belief personally, if he had made the hospitals in Nigeria better, he wouldn't have to travel for treatment and die in London. Because most of the people in Nigeria do not have the opportunity to even travel for leisure, talk less of hospitality or hospital tourism, if I would say.
You've just talked about how he has a complicated legacy, let's say. Not investing in healthcare is probably one of them. What would his supporters say to that, do you think?
They'll probably tell you you're lying.
Really?
But there are clear facts to that.
Yeah.
Probably lying, because I remember one of his spokesperson recently, he's called Femi Adesina, was mentioning that if he had been in Nigeria, he would have died earlier. So that speaks a lot about the administration itself. Because if your spokesperson is saying if you had gotten treatment in Nigeria, you would have died earlier, that's okay.
Yeah. That's mad. They're not completing the thought that, if they're admitting that, then the logical conclusion is they didn't do a good enough job.
Exactly. So what does that say about your citizens who, over the course of the years, you've regarded more cattle better than them, than the human lives there, that can't afford to travel to get healthcare?
Since his death, the sitting president of Nigeria has renamed a national airport after him. Why has he done that then?
I think sometimes people in Nigeria tend to respect their elders, and they have a common denominator that brings them together. They are from the same party, so they are members of what we call the All Progressive Congress, APC. So I think some form of alliance. He has to respect the dead or respect his godfather, I would say.
So he sounds like a contentious figure. What else is his legacy? What went on in Nigeria during his presidency? I
think from a young perspective, I think I would remember him not really for a good thing. Because the answers, we're speaking about Kenya earlier, and I was talking about the parallels in different countries. Similar to what happened in Kenya, in Nigeria, we had what we call the End SARS movement. Whereas End SARS basically is ending the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And that happened, and the people of the youth in Nigeria as well took on the street and started protesting, and the government officials sent police officers to shoot at them.
And just to explain what the NSAS was and what the SAS is, what is that? Explain to our listeners what that is.
So NSAS is called the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, basically aimed at protecting the citizens with robberies. So like if there's a robbery on the road, you report to them.
Right.
But they decided to like take their own initiative. I don't know whose initiative it was, to start profiling young people because they were probably presenting more reach. And so they thought that it was best for them to question their wealth without making due diligence by reporting and just killing people aimlessly on the road. So that was happening across the line, and people were like, yeah, this is not normal. This is not what you're meant to do. We need to stop it and like make the government accountable for their actions. So the protest went out. People started questioning the government, and social media also played a big tool in that. During that year, people were live tweeting what was happening. I think the government officials were not really happy about that, and they shot at the citizens. I think, and a lot of people lost their lives, and the government said that didn't happen. And Buhari was really not happy about what's going on. Stopped Twitter for a year and a half, if I remember.
Right.
So that's one, as a young person, remembering seeing how your friends are going on the street, fighting for their lives, running away, how parents have lost their kids, how people's family are missing, and yet him denying that is questionable. Rest his soul, I would say. I think another thing I remember is the cashless policy, where members in Nigeria were told not to use cash anymore. So like people who not necessarily would have paid for their other people's services, maybe hospital or whatnot, because of there were no cash in the society anymore, people's lives were lost. So I think his supporters are really being naive of what gone on, and the barest minimum he has provided, it seems like the shining star for them. So he has done more harm than good, but I'll say to each their own.
I mean, these have been two pretty depressing examples of what's happened in Africa this week. Why is it that these things are happening, do you think? Is there any responsibility we have in the West for what's going on? Like, why is it relevant to us here, do you think?
To know about it?
Why do you think these cycles of presidents are coming in and cycles of protests happening?
I think I will blame colonialism, because in the sense that when you see for a long period of time being led in a certain way, you come into the position and you think you have to copy that. You have to be
leading in a brutal way.
Exactly. So you have to be the brutal one. You have to be the firm one, because that had happened.
Right.
And it's not so. And also the lack of accountability, and maybe the international bodies are overly meddling with the affairs of people.
Right,
back
okay.
home. So I could think...
Just too much
interference. Too much interference.
Right, okay.
Because they have no monopoly of their actions. And if there is monopoly, there's no accountability to what wrong they are doing. So they just keep on pushing and treating their citizens like, well, I'm not really accountable to you anyways. There's little you can do. So focus on the place that when they are maybe giving their monthly reports, they can touchen up the nice things and show, because there's no external factors trying to investigate the other sectors that are in their report.
If the West wants to sort of not interfere, but still help, can, the workers of many charities in Wales, for example, serve as an example of how to help in a non-problematic way or in a non-disruptive way? They seem to be more community-to-community partnerships. Do you think that's a good way?
Yeah, I think the community-to-community partnership is probably the best thing that can happen, because, like I said, most of these government officials projects, they focus on the fact that people can easily get access to go see, because nobody's going to travel like 10 hours to go see a little village and wonder what's happening there. But community-to-community partnership would help that. And it says that people who already have personal links would be willing to travel, and there's more of a streamlined version of seeing how things can be implemented. So there's no many structures of hierarchy there. So it's like maybe from the person who has the established link to pushing it, so you know that the project's actually going to be done. Whereas waiting for the government officials to take part in this project, they might start, but they also feel like, well, they're going to be given a second term, even a third term. They can linger how long the project is going to take for.
Right, yeah. Briefly, let's finish on something a bit more positive and fun. The there's some sort of sport event has been happening. What's been happening?
So in Uganda, Kampala, from the 8th of 19th, there's like a rugby match happening. So unifying the African continent to playing together. I think most people, everywhere in Africa seems depressing at the moment. So having like a football match, unifying ideologies, seeing new teammates, seeing new teams, and unifying the context that sports brings us together. In as much as music, is relaxing to see that a global federation is interested in rugby and Uganda is going to be the host city, and people just having fun, coming together, smiling, and hoping the best nation wins the match.
Very cool. Google that later. Man, thank you, Ari.
Thank you, Pete, for having me.
And that's it from Wales, Africa and the World. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Carwyn Jones for being our guest this week. And thank you, Ore, for joining me to discuss what's happening in Africa this week. If you want to get in touch with us to learn more about the international development sector in Wales, or about accessing support or anything else, please do so via our website, hubcymruafrica.wales. This has been Wales, Africa and the World. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for listening.